so that other folks can enjoy it. So Secure Our Vote is a coalition committed to making sure every voter is able to mark a paper ballot by hand or with an assistive device, that the vote is subject to rigorous post-election audits to ensure accuracy, and that voter data is protected by the highest possible security standards and backed up to ensure every voter is able to cast a ballot on election day, even if there's a hack or a computer error. This coalition was founded by Public Citizen, Common Cause, the Center for American Progress, and Rock the Vote in 2017. And we're focused on engaging grassroots advocates at the state and local level, like many of you. Our goal is to take folks from a place of just election security to a place of informed empowerment, to provide clear solutions to the election security crisis, tools to help you communicate those solutions to your election officials and your elected officials, and to win more secure voting systems, from paper ballots to audits to secure voter data. We want you to build power and strong relationships with election officials wherever possible. If you haven't already signed up to be a poll worker, just a quick reminder before we dive in, that the best possible way to both help your local election officials and to better understand elections in your area is to be a poll worker. It's a long day. It's a long day for election officials too. It's really important that you give it a try if you haven't, if you're at all able to do that. This is our 11th webinar. We'll be taking questions in the chat box, so feel free to type them in there as they come to you. This allows us to see which questions are most popular so we can make sure to get to those. If we have time, we'll take live questions at the end. You'll be able to view the recording of this webinar as well as our other webinars on secureourvote.us. There's a ton of resources on the website as well, from a map of what election security priority we would rank the highest for your state, to email actions you can take right now, to toolkits like the toolkit from the Brennan Center for Justice that we'll be going over tonight. So I'm going to pivot to introduce our first speaker. Liz Howard is one of my favorite colleagues. She serves as the counsel for Brennan Center's Democracy Program. Prior to joining the Brennan Center, she served as the Deputy Commissioner to the Virginia Department of Elections, and she coordinated the decertification of all paperless voting systems in the state of Virginia. It's really incredible. But also e-motor voter programs and the adaptation of online paperless absentee ballot applications, so really making sure people are able to exercise their right to vote as well as securing the vote. And before that, she was general counsel at Rock the Vote, a nonprofit that's part of the Secure Our Vote Coalition, dedicated to engaging young people in politics. So take it away, Liz.
Thank you so much, Akini. It is such a pleasure to be here tonight. And like I said earlier, this presentation is so important and so timely. I will say that Akini was one of the first colleagues that I got to work with in this space, and she has been such a huge resource to me, and I'm sure that she is happy to continue to serve as a resource to everyone on this phone call. So the work that she does is very important, and I certainly appreciate it, and so does everyone else at the Brennan Center. So thank you for putting this together tonight, and also thank you for inviting my good friend Roki Silliman to join us. I think we're going to have a good time tonight. So thanks so much to everyone else who has joined the call. Akini asked me to join tonight because, like she said, we all have some reasonable concerns going into the midterms, but there are absolutely steps that you can take today with your election official to make the systems that you have more resilient. And that's kind of what we're going to focus on tonight. What can we do in the next 48 days before the election to make your systems more secure in your state and your county? The first slide that we have here is just a quick review about the voting process. I'm sure you are all familiar with this, but as you know, right, most local officials and all state election officials have a website that's got general information, including the date of the election, generally how to register, which is the next step here. Most states at this juncture have an online voter registration tool. All states have a statewide voter registration database. And the next step in the process is going to be the check-in piece, which you will be most familiar with when you go and vote in person. And many states use electronic poll books at this juncture, which are a great tool which makes the check-in process much smoother. We will talk about some of the vulnerabilities that those cause later on in this call. The next step is where you cast your vote. We will also talk about the different types of machines that you're going to be voting on and some of the concerns that we have, and again, how you can make that system more resilient. After that, exciting, the vote totals are reported. And then next, hopefully, and in most states, but not all, there is a post-election audit. We'll kind of go through what some of the gold standards for post-election audits are, and I'm so glad to see some friends from Virginia that have questions about the post-election audit process, because we've got some great news from Virginia and several other states across the state here. And then hopefully the election is certified after the audit is completed, but that's not always the case. So first we'll go over concerns and what you can do with voter registration databases. This is an area that we think is probably at the highest risk. Many of you saw back in 2016 that the Illinois state voter registration database was successfully breached by hackers. We, at this juncture, understand that the hackers didn't alter any of the information and didn't otherwise change any of the information in the database. But we've got a couple common sense solutions that you can talk to your state election officials about to make sure that this system is as secure as it can be right now. So for instance, one common sense solution is to ensure that there's a blackout period. So between now and Election Day, you shouldn't be making any non-critical updates or patches to the voter registration database. So for instance, in Virginia, we had a 60-day blackout period. So if we needed to make any updates or do any patching, we had a process that required our state election CIO to sign a form. It also required the actual state CIO to sign off on making that update. And we would obviously run a lot of tests, but it was, you know, if we did anything to that database, it was very well thought out. Next off, right, like simple solutions such as making sure that the state is making offsite backups on a day-to-day basis of your voter registration database. So if you're, I believe that Akini sent you the information. So these things are on page 2 of our election security advanced planning checklist that you can actually call your state and or local election officials and go over. The next area we want to talk about is the states that use electronic poll books, but don't require that each locality have a paper backup of the e-poll books. Electronic poll books, just like any other machines, are capable of malfunctioning or going down, or, you know, if you have election officials that perhaps didn't get the sufficient training, aren't able to turn them on in the morning. One of the easiest solutions is to make sure that each polling location be provided with a paper copy of the list of voters for each precinct at the beginning of the day. We saw this, the fact that that North Carolina, for instance, doesn't require paper poll books caused problems in the November 2016 election, where we had voters waiting for multiple hours when they had problems with their electronic poll books across multiple counties. And this is something that we can just easily avoid. It doesn't require any statutory changes, and it's something that election officials can often just opt in to do, and they have discretion to do that. So this is a great map that shows you the different states that use electronic poll books. Some of them do already require that you have a paper backup, but some of them do not. So we have Roki on the phone with us to talk about South Carolina. So we'll kind of go through how you talk to an election official about opting in to having a paper backup at the polls on election day. The next system that we're going to talk about is the actual voting equipment. So some of you live in one of the states that continues to use paperless DREs. These states appear in the map that you see in front of you in either pink or red. The red states are the states that use paperless DREs, the direct recording electronic machines that look a lot like ATMs statewide. These machines, these states highlighted in pink or red, do not create a paper trail of any sort, and experts agree that these are a serious security concern. To the extent that we are going to go into election day, even in Georgia, using these paperless machines, there are still things that we can do and you can do, again, in conjunction with your local election officials to make our systems more resilient. One of the easiest things that you can work with your local election official to do is to ensure that they have emergency paper ballots sufficient to accommodate 2 to 3 hours of peak voting in the event to accommodate something where the machines go down and or malfunction. And this is another specific area where we will talk to Roki, because he had a runoff in Columbia, which was unplanned for, and they ran into machine issues, and he was able to ensure that voters could continue voting and that voting was not interrupted in spite of the fact that his machines failed, because he had implemented these simple common sense solutions and had emergency paper ballots on hand. And there's also a note in here from the ruling in the Georgia case that we just got 2 nights ago. Many of you have seen some information about this case. The plaintiffs requested that the court, in essence, decertify the paperless DREs that were in use in Georgia. The court's opinion came out, and while she didn't mandate an immediate transition, she had a lot of concerns about the continued use of this equipment. And for instance, she said, continued reliance on the use of DRE machines in public elections likely results in a debasement or dilution of the weight of plaintiffs' votes. In essence, this ruling was the best case scenario that we could get short of having the machines decertified in Georgia. So in whole, that this case is good for us, and we will this case will likely be used in the remaining states that continue to use paperless DREs after the November election. This slide notes that, you know, a lot of states will report their election results online. There may or may not be reporting system failures or outages. Note, this map does not indicate where there have been outages or failures. It's just a map that shows the vote distribution. But please know that this is potentially a problem, and we've already experienced it this year. So for instance, in Knox County back in May, their election night's results reporting page was successfully breached. That page was not connected to any actual election results. So it didn't impact the actual election. But this is one of the areas that we also have significant concerns about, because one of the main goals of foreign nation states who are contemplating interfering with our elections is to have a negative impact on all of our confidence in our American electoral system. And so something where you have a successful breach on election night and somebody you can't get to the election results causes problems. And again, we've got some pretty common sense solutions here. So they just need to establish a redundant election night reporting system that can be used in the case of an outage. And then we also recommend that you not connect your election night reporting systems to voting systems or the statewide voter registration system database. So in Knox County, even though they went down and we weren't able to get the results, it wasn't, it was a contained problem because they were not connected to the voting systems or the voter registration database. So that was the good news out of that. And then finally, and I think I am running out of time, so we will talk about this later if you would like to, but here is a map of the states that do not require post-election audits. A lot of this, there's a lot of overlap with the states that continue to use the paperless DREs, because if you do not have a paper trail, you cannot conduct a meaningful audit of your election results. And in that case, you know, this is again another area where you can talk to your local election official about what you can do. And with that, I think Akini wanted to open it up for questions.
Yeah, if you have a question for Liz about what she's presented here, this is the moment to post that. I see we already have one question that I think is pretty broad. What can you say about cybersecurity between states' databases and ERIC, Electronic Registration Information Center?
ERIC is not going to be, won't have a direct connection to your state voter registration database. So ERIC is going to collect data from multiple other databases, such as the Social Security database and the state DMV. And it will provide information, but it's not going to sync directly to your state voter registration database.
Other questions for Liz? If you haven't seen the checklist, I'm actually going to pull it up here in a moment, because I think that it might be, I think we might have a minute later to go through it in a little more detail, given that we aren't as overwhelmed as I expected we might be. But it's really detailed, and the idea is that you take the checklist, you read the report so you fully understand it, and then you take the checklist to your election official and have a friendly meeting with them and ask them about the different components and see what is possible and try to make a good connection with them, but also encourage them to take these concrete steps. And you'll see Liz and Roki kind of go through a conversation like that, including the realistic constraints that election officials are under, even very friendly, very brilliant, and security committed election officials are under, so that it's really important to kind of be prepared for that piece. I'm just waiting. Is there anybody else who has a question that's relevant to Liz's presentation in particular?
Well, I see a question about New Jersey, which I think is a good question. So it says, how do we require audits in New Jersey when we use paperless DREs? That doesn't make sense. And that's an excellent question. Like I said, you can't have a meaningful audit of the election outcomes if you don't have paper ballots or a paper trail. There are some states, and Roki can talk about this, where they use paperless DREs and they conduct an audit. It's not an audit that we would consider to be robust and sufficient to provide confidence in the election outcome. But there are procedures that they do in South Carolina and some other states that use paperless DREs that they consider an audit.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to, I can talk about that just very quickly. With South Carolina, we do have paperless DREs, and I agree with the question that an audit of an election with a paperless DRE system is, I don't want to say it's meaningless, but there's not a lot of value to it. We do an audit here in South Carolina where we're auditing all of the memory cards, all of the flash cards, to make sure that everything reported properly. And if there's been any discrepancies. And we have to note any sort of manual entries into the system, which would be a discrepancy. But it's not nearly as robust as an audit system where we would be counting, paper ballots or checking the machines to, checking a paper trail against the machines. I've done audits with paper trails on DREs in Ohio, and they work provided that the paper trail works. part of the issue with paper trails on DRE machines is that they do jam, especially on the machines that I used in Ohio. We noticed that they were jamming on about 10% of the equipment, and the jams would take several votes because some of the voters weren't doing their job by checking the paper trail itself to see if their votes were being recorded. We would go through 3 or 4 voters before a voter would say, hey, this is jammed up, and it would be fixed. But then we would lose the paper accounting for those ballots.
Oh, wow.
So, go ahead.
I said, wow.
Yeah, I advocate for strong audit systems in every state, and I believe that we should have a pre-election audit of our equipment and a post-election audit of our equipment. We did a pre- and post-election audit of our DREs when I was in DC. We did hash code testing to make sure that none of the software had been modified in any of the DREs pre-election to post-election. But that's not a realistic test for every jurisdiction to do. It's expensive, and no one has the resources to be able to do that on a statewide basis. We were fortunate in Washington, D.C. We had a small enough jurisdiction that we could do something like that. Yeah.
Okay. I think we have time for one more quick question, and then we've got a bunch of great questions that we'll punt to the next question period in about 10 minutes. Here in Maryland, we have been recording our votes on paper and scanning them electronically and saving them onto thumb drives. What are the security issues related to that system?
So one of the main concerns comes with the auditing of those electronically saved and digital records. In Maryland, when they conduct a post-election audit, they don't actually go back to the paper record. In Maryland, they audit the copies of the ballots. So that is not a best practice. The best practice is when you audit to ensure that the election outcome is accurate, you go back to the original files. This is because just like you can successfully attack and hack perhaps a paperless DRE, you could absolutely hack the equipment that is saving the files with the copies of the ballots on them. So you want to make sure that you are using the original paper record, or what you know to be an accurate representation of the original paper record to do the post-election audit. So that's I think Maryland can do a better job there.
Great, thanks. And we have a bunch of other great questions. I hope we'll get to them. But I want to introduce our next speaker, who's already spoken a little bit. Roki W. Silliman II is the director of Richland County, South Carolina Office of Elections and Voter Registration. He's been a senior election official in the District of Columbia in major counties in Virginia and Ohio. He's conducted over 40 elections and consulted with over a dozen other entities, states, nonprofits, countries on elections and politics. And he has a much longer bio, but I'm going to turn it over to him to share his perspective on recovery planning and election security. Thank you.
No, thank you, and thanks for having me. To start off, about like recovery issues, and as was said earlier, we had an issue here in Richland County in a couple weeks ago, August 28th, in a runoff election, where we had to program our equipment. We have 10 days to program our equipment between the primary and the runoff. And it doesn't give us enough time to do a lot of the proper testing that we should do. And we had machine failures in the morning from flashcards that failed to program properly. Although I was pulling my hair out and turning very gray at 6:30 in the morning as we were getting phone calls in from the polling locations saying that the machines weren't operating, we were quickly able to figure out from the machine errors that they were receiving that the flashcards were incorrect, and we could reprogram flashcards. But that takes time and energy to get those correct flashcards at the polling locations. We didn't skip a beat because all of our polling locations do have a minimum number of paper ballots in case of machine failure. So by 8:30 in the morning, we were able to get out the flashcards to all of the precincts. There's 11 precincts out of a total of 39 precincts that we had open that day. So it was almost 25% of our polling locations had issues. but we're able to recover from it, and only through proper planning and training. Our poll workers all knew what to do. We had the paper ballots there. We were lucky it was a lower turnout. It was an off election and a runoff, which is the lowest of low turnouts. But we still had enough paper ballots where we didn't skip a beat. No one was disenfranchised, and we were able to recover. And I was also able to reach out to all of the media, the local television stations, and the newspaper, and inform them of what happened. A lot of times we have these issues as local election officials, and we don't communicate properly with the media, letting them know what's going on and how we're recovering from it. And that mitigates the issue. As long as you're communicating with folks and people understand that A, there's a problem, B, this is what we're doing to fix it, and we do it after action, so C, this doesn't happen again, we can recover from just about anything. So we were really fortunate enough to handle that, and we found out that it was a hardware error during our programming. One of our programming machines failed, and we're not going to be using that for the November election coming up. We're going to be hand programming individually the flashcards instead of mass programming them, which is going to add dozens of hours to our programming necessity, but it's what we're going to have to do in order to make sure that everything comes off well. When it comes to cybersecurity and issues, there's a lot of things that local election officials cannot do because a lot of it is out of our hands. The issues with statewide registration databases, depending on the state that you are located in, those issues lay at the state level, be it the Secretary of State, State Elections Board, Lieutenant Governor, whoever's in control of the election environment in that locale, in that state. There are some states, Ohio is one of them, that has what's known as a bottom-up system, where the counties are in charge of each individual voter registration database, and they send the data to a statewide database, and it gives the counties a little bit more control over what they can do and can't do. Most of those databases are not connected to the internet in any way. And in Ohio, for example, I would back up the databases. We wouldn't back them up daily, we'd back them up weekly, and we would hold the backups for a total of 60 days. And we did that primarily for the fact that registration cutoff in Ohio was 30 days before an election, and we wanted to have 30 days of records before that in case of something happening to our agency. And we weren't at the time as concerned with cyber activity as we were physical destruction of our agency. If there was a fire in our polling in our building and we lost our database, we had stored off-site the database so we could recover from at least that week. And we wanted to have several weeks so that we could compare databases to see if there are any errors when it comes to that thing. So those are some of the things that locals can do if they have control of the databases. In South Carolina and in Virginia, where I've worked, the state controls those databases. And it's a web-based system, and we communicate back and forth. We update voter registrations on a daily basis. It links with the online voter registration, and we're constantly fixing our data. So a lot of that cybersecurity has to rest with the state. And in South Carolina, we've been very proactive. I commend the state for what they've done in cybersecurity training for folks. We have actually, the state of South Carolina has done their own phishing attacks on local election officials to see if they can be susceptible to clicking on harmful links. And for those that clicked on a link that the state sent out, that their access was revoked until they took cybersecurity training classes. So it's those types of things that were a lot of people being very proactive about cybersecurity. When it comes to the machines and the paperless DRE machines, I share the same concerns that others share with a machine that isn't independently auditable with a voter activated piece of paper. That said, we have to work with the equipment that we have, at this time. We do have strong chains of custody here in South Carolina, where we program the equipment, we seal the equipment, we record all of the serial numbers on all of the seals. There's multiple seals on each machine. And then the machines are delivered to polling locations where those machine numbers are recorded as being received at the polling location. And then the poll workers on election morning have to verify that all of the seal numbers match the seal numbers that they were given prior to election day, to ensure that that none of the machines have had someone access them without any authority. If we get a report that seal numbers do not match, those machines are not used. They're to be taken out, and we're to have spare machines, sent out, and we would use the paper ballots that we have at a polling location in between. Fortunately, we've not had that incident. I have had a situation in Ohio where I received a phone call that none of the seals matched any of the machines. And I'm like, what do you mean none of the seals match none of these? Like, seriously, none of these seals match the numbers. And myself and a sheriff's deputy went out to the polling location. And by the time we got to the polling location, they had realized that they were looking at the wrong seal numbers. And they were looking at seal numbers that they were supposed to use to close the machines at the end of the night. And they were very apologetic. But I'm like, no, you did what you were supposed to do. You're supposed to call us, and this is what a chain of custody is supposed to look like. If you have any questions, you're supposed to call us so we can investigate it. It's important for your local officials to have strong chains of custody. If they cannot prove that there's not been any unauthorized access to the equipment, then you can't dissuade someone from alleging that there's been unauthorized access to the equipment. I do encourage you, bless you, I do encourage you to talk to your local election officials and build the communication. I strive to build bridges with both the media and the citizens of any jurisdiction I've worked in, and I've worked in several here in the United States. One of the things that I tell folks is that I'm the administrator of the elections, but the elections belong to you, the people. My job is to be the caretaker and make sure that they're operated efficiently and with integrity. And I can honestly say that I know election officials from all around the country, and we all strive for the same result. A lot of them have different partisan leanings, but most of the election officials, if not all, of the local election officials I know conduct elections with the utmost integrity. We look at activists as our partners, and we hope that the activists look at us as partners too. This is something that we cannot just handle 70 or 49 days before an election, 48 days before an election. This is an ongoing process. We need your help in 2019 preparing for 2020. In South Carolina, we are having issues with funding for our new voting equipment. The State Election Commission has told the legislature for several years we need to get new voting equipment. Our voting equipment is 14 years old. That's just the physical age of the equipment. The technological age of the equipment is over 20, 25 years old. And we've told them we need more, but the legislatures haven't made that a priority. We're hoping this year that they do. The court case in Georgia is going to help. Phone calls from citizens help. That's what we need. We need folks talking to their legislators and saying, listen, this has to be a priority and we need to get this fixed.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Sure.
We have a couple questions for you already, but I wonder if I can field one, which is, if there's anything that you think that most election officials either probably have done or could easily still do before 2018, is there anything particular you'd flag for people who are in all different states all over the country?
In 2018, like right now, we're 49 days out. I mean, right now, I am programming voting equipment. We don't program voting equipment a week or two before the election. It takes us several weeks to do the testing and the programming and everything else. There's not a lot that can be done at the local level if we haven't already had funding for it. You can't go to your local agency and say, we want all of this paper ballot 49 days before an election if the funding isn't there for it. And that's part of the issue. We do have paper ballots. The recommendation is, for 2 or 3 hours of peak voting. I don't know that we could survive 2 to 3 hours of peak voting, but we would be able to get more paper ballots out. At the time we have a ballot on demand printer, so I could print more ballots and get those out. But our priority would be trying to get new voting machines out there, because that's the only way we'd be able to function and get the voting going. I saw one question here where somebody was asking, how do we get the seal numbers to the poll workers on election day? What we would typically do is seal it in an envelope with your supplies and seal that envelope up with a seal. So it's kind of like the Oscars, that envelope is not tampered with. And you open up the Oscar envelope and then you pull out your seal numbers to look to see if your seal numbers match. It's something that you have to prepare for. Some localities do it, some do not. I would ask all of your local election officials, what is your chain of custody? How do you measure your chain of custody so that the equipment, when it leaves a local election official's office, how do we know when it gets to a polling location that there hasn't been unauthorized access to it?
Great. Do you recommend county control? Does that work, given your experience across different states?
I prefer, and in some aspects, I prefer local control over a lot of things. It gives me a lot more flexibility than a state-run election system. We have a state-run election system here in South Carolina, and I don't have as much flexibility with certain aspects of it that I'm used to in other jurisdictions in Virginia, DC, and Ohio that I've worked in. There are pluses and minuses for both. Do I recommend local control of a voter registration database? No. I think that's better suited for the state in this day and age, especially with cybersecurity issues. I believe that the states have more resources overall to handle cybersecurity issues and educate the locals than having each individual local county. In some jurisdictions in South Carolina and in Virginia, there's not even a local IT department in some small counties, let alone having a cybersecurity department of an IT department. So I think that it's better to have a state-run voter registration system.
Great, thanks. I think the next few questions are for either one of you, and then we're going to pivot to a role play and then take more questions.
I can, if I see one question here from Sally G, where she's talking about how she hit a nerve with her county supervisor by mentioning hackability, and they said that they took it as a personal attack on her integrity. We are sensitive folks in this business because all we do is get beat up. We are expected to run our industry with 100% success rate all of the time. No one focuses on our agencies until there is something bad and we get beat up. So election officials across the country are slightly defensive. And what I'd ask all of the folks is build relationships with folks. Go to the county election meetings. Now, I realize that sometimes they may not be conducive to people who work. Meetings may be in the day. Some localities have them in the evening. If you can attend the meetings, please do. If not, ask to meet with the local election officials over coffee. Get to know them. Talk to them. Don't bombard them with, are you doing this? Are you doing this? Are you doing this? Are you doing this? Because we're unfortunately automatically going to get defensive and think that you're criticizing our work, when if we understand that we're all on the same page, and we all want nothing but integrity for our elections, it'll be better for us to all work together.
For the folks who are on the phone who've been working on this for a long time, for decades, who've got a range of experience in the relationship or lack, the tension with the election officials in their area has solidified. Do you have any recommendations for either how to regain connections or where else to look to help change the situation in favor of some reforms?
I would partner with the local League of Women Voters first and foremost. Reach out to them. Most localities have a local League of Women Voters, and most of those local leagues have good relationships with their boards. Meet with the leagues. Everybody shares the same agenda. We may not be speaking the same language, but we're all sharing the same agenda. And ask to maybe partner with the league in that aspect of it. The other thing is, like I said, invite them out for a cup of coffee or come to the office with a box of donuts, those kinds of things. Build the relationships. You'll get a lot further if you approach the election officials with concern, but in how can we do this together? How can I help you achieve these goals? Is there anything that I can do to help you? And a lot of that will be, yes, you can talk to my funding authority, be it at the local level, the state level, or the federal level, and tell them this is what we need. This is the funding. In South Carolina, I'll give you a list of representatives and senators to call and say, fund new voting equipment. Same thing in Georgia, fund new voting equipment. Those are the partnerships that we can build. And we could talk about post-election audits. And you invite people in as an election official, local election official. If I have room, I'm like, come on in on election night. See what we actually do. See how the process works. And a lot of times, that goes a long way too. When people actually see what we do to prepare for the election.
Great. Okay, well, I think we'll get to a lot more questions. We're going to do a quick role play between Liz and Roki, modeling somebody with concerns, Liz, an election official facing specific constraints, Roki, and hopefully coming out of it with some action items where they agree that there's some things they could do. And I think, you'll see some of the back and forth that happens. And luckily, Roki's really wonderful. But let's show them what it could be like.
Okay, but I did see a question here that I'm like,
go for it.
Well, I just saw somebody posted, my county election administrator recommended yesterday to get rid of paper backups in order to avoid audits because they're a pain. I just at that point I say, wow. Audits protect our integrity. As a local election official, I am all happy about audits because audits get everybody off my case. If I do post-election audits and show that the machines are functioning properly, and we do robust audits, everybody relaxes. And that's been my experience when I've had post-election audits. I started out where a lot of people attend them, and it's like a lot of how do things go, and then when they see how it works and things are great, the next one there's not so many people, and then by the fourth or fifth election audit, we're doing the audits ourselves. No one's there anymore because they have regained that faith in their system, and they have the faith in their local election administrator and say, hey, listen, this is, they are doing everything correctly. So I don't know who this administrator is, but I'm an administrator, and I know a lot of my fellow administrators treat that as our friends because it's not questioning our integrity, it's proving our integrity.
Great. And I'll speak more to the power building side of the organizing too, where you really are squished and you can't get any election officials on your side, but we're going to focus on doing that positive work now because I know some of you are in places where you don't have those relationships solidified either way yet. Take it away.
Okay. Hi, Mr. Silliman. My name is Liz Howard, and I'm a voter in Richland County. I know you're very busy in the run-up to the election, but I've seen some headlines recently about election security, and I have some concerns. I was hoping that I could ask you some questions, and we could talk through how you're making our elections more secure.
I'm happy to, Liz, nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Yeah, happy to sit down and talk. We are busy. We're 48 days out of the election. We've proofed our databases. We've proofed all of our ballots, our splits. We've got all the ballot styles ready to go. We're getting ready to program our voting equipment and put it through logic and accuracy testing. That's going to take us a couple of weeks, but sure. What would you like to know?
Oh, well, I'm so excited to hear that you are getting ready to do your logic and accuracy testing. I know that that's an important piece of making sure our election is secure. I remember that we vote on machines where there's no paper backup. Is that right?
That is correct. In South Carolina, we do not have a paper backup currently for our voting machines.
So some of the experts are recommending that you have 2 to 3 hours of emergency paper ballots because, you know, machines fail, whether they're voting machines or refrigerators or anything else. Is that part of your election day planning?
We do have emergency paper ballots available for the polling locations. I would say that we probably do not have enough for a 2 to 3 hour machine outage.
Oh, why is that?
Well, what we do have, first of all, is we have enough machines. We have one machine for every 250 voters. So if we have an isolated machine outage, which occurs, the machines are old. Sometimes the batteries aren't functioning properly. Sometimes the calibration on the screen is bad and we have to recalibrate it, so we take it out and use it. We typically have enough machines to recover from that. If there was an entire issue with a precinct where all of our machines went down in a precinct, we have enough paper ballots to get us through, I would say, an hour or two, depending on turnout. But our priority then would be getting our backup machines. We have several, backup machines that we have in our warehouse or with our technicians in the field that we could get to polling locations in case of an emergency like that. Our priority would be getting other voting machines out. In South Carolina, one of the issues that we have it's money with paper ballots.
How so?
Paper ballots hopefully are never used. You know, we hopefully we don't have an issue with the machines, and the paper ballots sit there. But those paper ballots cost money. Paper ballots are typically about 25 cents a ballot, upwards to 35, 40 cents a ballot. If we're ordering, I have a county of 250,000 registered voters. If I'm spending $10,000 or $15,000 on ballots that are never used, there are some folks who say that we're wasting money. And it's not considered to be an emergency priority. It's a waste of taxpayer funds. And our budgets, local election official budgets, are just not funded to the point where other county agencies are funded.
So would it just be a matter of perhaps, working with you to request additional funding from the local board for?
Absolutely, because we go to our local funding authorities, every year for our budget requests, and we always tell them we need more money. Well, that's what they expect to hear from every agency department head, is that I need more money. And we'll write our justifications for our budgets. But when it comes to a local county, for example, they have to fund police and fire first. They have to fund schools first. They have to fund everything else. And then they get to the elections officials and we get what we can. We need folks to come out, citizens to speak, because that's who the funders respond to. The funders don't respond to us asking for more money. The funders respond to voters telling them that they need to provide us more money. So that's what we can do. We could sit down and explain why we would need more money for either more paper ballots for backup, or preferably to get rid of these machines and have a paper-based system to begin with. Fund that, and that's how we would need your help. That's how you could really help us.
Well, maybe we can get together after the election to talk about some lobbying efforts that maybe we can work together on, because I'm so appreciative that you are clearly taking election security seriously, and so am I and many of my friends.
No, and we'd love to. And we just apologize. I mean, that right now we are already working long hours. I'm 48 days out from the election. I'm already working weekends, doing programming and testing. We've started working 50, 55-hour weeks now, and we'll be doing 60 to 70-hour weeks through October. So our time is eaten up quite a bit just by the preparations that we have to do, the training of all our local election officials and everything. So I might not be as available pre-election period, but I'd love to sit down after the election and say, hey, how can you help us? And I'll give you all kinds of ways to do it.
Well, that sounds great, and I'll send a follow-up email to try to get on your calendar shortly after the election. But I do want to talk about your electronic poll books too, if you'll let me take just another minute.
Yeah.
So I understand that experts recommend that when you use electronic poll books, that you have a pre-printed paper backup list of voters for each location. Do you do that in Richland County?
Yeah. Here in South Carolina, we have our paper poll books, which are nothing but antiquated laptops. They're old laptops. Some of them are 7 years old, and the only function they're used for is electronic poll books. Everything is locked down on it. They don't even have wireless capability to access anything. And we do, in case that they do fail, we do have paper poll books with everything, and the poll workers are instructed right away to pull those out and start using those. If we are able to get the electronic poll books back up, the poll workers will take some downtime and enter the names from the paper poll book into the electronic system so that we can make sure there's no, double voting or anything like that.
That's great. Well, this has been really helpful. I so appreciate your time. I will follow up and send you my contact information, and I will be in touch after the election. And I look forward to working with you, and thank you so much for all you're doing.
No, thank you. And like I said, I'm happy to direct you into the right place, to yell at the right people so that we can get this thing going.
Thank you.
Awesome. So I know some of you are probably listening and thinking, wow, Liz is so charming. And also, my election official would never be that nice to me, or even take my call. And some of them will be, and many of them maybe won't be. And that's why we also have to build power. It's not either or. You need to, if you want to win, if you want to protect our elections and secure the vote, you have to both be charming like Liz, with people that are powerful decision makers. You can't afford to make enemies with any election officials on this, your state election officials, your local election officials. And if you're ready to that point, then you really have to focus on building power, or waiting until there's new election officials. Some people have run when those spots are open and gotten their own folks elected. But you do have to build power, right? It's not one or the other. If we're going to convince Mr. Silliman's elected officials to fund everything that he wants to do, there's going to have to be a bunch of voters willing to go to those county officials and say, this is a top priority for me. I want my tax dollars going towards this. Even if everything is hunky-dory and you've got a rock star election director like Roki, you still have to have power. And if you don't have someone on your side, you can bet those election officials have a lot of power with your elected officials already, because they're the folks that run the election that got them where they're at. And so you have to build power at least as much as those election officials have, and probably more, which means talking to people, doing outreach, sharing webinars and videos at events of other organizations, collecting petition signatures, inviting people to your meetings, being a good organizer. So I'm not ignoring that. That's really important. And one of the things that Secure a Vote does is help coach you on the organizing side and help you grow your group. Because if you're not growing and adding new members as a constant thing, you're probably not growing your power either. And that's not always true, but it's often true. So I'm not ignoring that piece, and happy to help folks on another call with organizing strategy. But we have a lot of great questions for our panelists, so I want to get back to those. Do you guys want to pick your questions, or would you like me to?
Yeah, you go ahead. Yeah.
Well, one of the questions that I saw was about model legislation. So first off, you've got to make a decision about where your state is on the election security spectrum. We've got a couple great federal bills that have a lot of important pieces to it. So for instance, the Election Security Act, which has been co-sponsored by about, I believe, 100 House members at this juncture. So that does a lot of important work, including offering incentives to conduct post-election audits, specifically the gold standard of post-election audits called risk limiting audits. It also provides additional funding for the election assistance Commission, which is the federal agency that serves as a clearinghouse for information about how elections are run and conducted and best practices across the country, which is another question that I think we got, right? Every state has a unique election administration ecosystem. And Roki's worked in several different jurisdictions, and so have I. It does make it challenging, but I also, I love when I get to engage in a different state or a different jurisdiction, and you see how you can pick up what works well, and take it back home with you. So that's an exciting, I think it's an exciting feature, even if it does present some challenges. So if there's a specific piece that you're looking for, if you are interested in post-election auditing, that's certainly something that we can send to Akini. There's some great bills. I think there was a great bill put up this cycle in Ohio, and there have been some other great bills, including the PAVE Act by Senator Wyden, that includes some great language for post-election audits, specifically risk-limiting audits.
There's one question I see here. It says, do you know of states that have asked and received DHS or National Guard help with cybersecurity? And if so, what help is available from them? Yes, DHS is doing a fantastic job of doing outreach to state and local election officials. Here in South Carolina, we had the South Carolina National Guard do a review of election agencies a few years ago and highlight risks that we had internally with our computers and our software systems. And then we just had a very large 2-day cybersecurity meeting with DHS and other folks to discuss what is available to us for help as the local and the state election officials. So that is out there. And I do have to say that I think that DHS is doing a great job of reaching out to folks. And I commend Matt Masterson, former election commissioner at the EAC, who is now over at DHS as the cybersecurity election person, and doing a lot of outreach. But they're going to have to do more. There's a lot more that needs to be done.
So there's a question about New York State. So New York State recently had their primary, and one of the things that happened is there were some places where, well, let me back up. So in New York State, you have paper ballots, which is great. One of the things that they don't have is a requirement that you order sufficient paper ballots for 100% of the registered voter in each polling place. This unfortunately kind of touches on what Roki was talking about earlier, often in an effort to save money. Election officials will try to estimate the turnout and buy ballots only sufficient to cover their estimated turnout. And a lot of times it's very difficult to predict what turnout is going to be. It proved difficult for some election officials in New York again this year. And there were ballot shortages and outages reported across the state. And this is something that is just absolutely easy to avoid. While ballots do cost a quarter-ish, like Roki said, maybe 25 cents to maybe 40 cents on the high end, that money is well spent and important to ensure that, every voter gets the opportunity to cast their ballot. So for New York State, I think that would be an important move that you could make there, is to require that election officials order sufficient ballots for 100% turnout in all elections.
And I'm going to reiterate that, yes. And if you have a paper-based system, I do not understand any jurisdiction that doesn't order 100% of the paper ballots in a completely paper-based system. And one of the things that I say is that in a paper-based system, you are going to have some inherent waste with the ballots, but that's where I blame the waste on the taxpayer at that point. Because if we do have a paper-based system, you have to understand, as an election official, think of a wedding reception that we're hosting. And we know that there's 1,000 people that have received an invitation for that wedding reception, but not one of them to send an RSVP. So we have to have 1,000 plates ready for those people to show up. That's how we have to handle an election. We have to have 1,000 ballots for those people. If voters would call and say, hey, I'm not going to vote, don't get my ballot, you know, we could cut those ballots down. But that's a system where the waste is blamed on I blame the taxpayer because you folks didn't show up to vote or out there and vote. And that's where I don't think it is actually a waste of money, because that's the system that we're running. It's a paper-based system. We have to have it. That's where I flip the coin on the waste.
I want to just flag we're at 9 o'clock. If folks need to hop off, you can. 2 panelists, are you willing to go till 9:10?
Sure.
I'm willing to chat for, yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Liz.
Well, I think there's a good comment, right, about machines that can print ballots on demand. So just from my experience in 2017 in Virginia, there was a special election for Senate. This election was could determine control of the Senate in Virginia. We had a locality that, again, in an effort to save money, ordered a very small number of ballots because they thought turnout on a very cold day in a district that, you know, there was a presumed winner wasn't going to have a high turnout. Unfortunately, and they also felt more confident about ordering a smaller number of paper ballots because they had a ballot on demand device in each precinct. So they thought they had some room for error because they thought, right, like they can just print more as needed. So by about 10 or 10:30 a.m. that morning, they were running out of ballots in polling locations across the district. They promptly moved voters to voting on the one machine in the location that could produce a ballot on demand. Unfortunately, we found that those machines, the machines that they were using there, were not built to accommodate all the voters in one precinct. They had issues with, just for instance, the toner. The toner ran out within a couple of hours of moving over to the ballot on demand devices. And so there are significant problems, often unexpected, that you run into when you try to rely on other equipment that is not specifically built to accommodate all the voters on election day. So again, we think it's just something you can easily avoid.
And Liz, I agree with you. I personally would never rely on a ballot on demand system at a polling location as my backup. I'm asking too much of my poll workers in a technical capacity to manage a ballot on demand system. Let alone the toner running out and those types of things. One of the issues that I've seen, and I tell people, where in a small election where I think it's going to be a low turnout, I'm still ordering. If I were to order like that, I'd still be ordering 50 to 60% of the ballots. If I thought it was going to be a 20% turnout, I'm ordering 50 to 60%. I've seen local election officials say, well, I think turnout's going to be 10%. I'm going to order 25% for all my precincts. Well, turnout actually was 15%. Overall turnout was 15%. But they had 2 precincts where turnout was 40% and 2 precincts where turnout was 5%. And they didn't have enough ballots for the precincts that were over. They thought they planned accordingly because they nailed the overall turnout. But there are individual spikes within individual polling locations where turnout is going to be higher or turnout's going to be lower for whatever reason. So I've seen election officials do it, and I question the sanity of those decisions. And I realize again that sometimes it's a funding issue, but that's where if I'm going to waste money, I'm going to try to do it there.
Great. We have a couple more questions, and then I think we'll wrap. Liz, there's one about trying to get audits for mail-in ballots. I don't know if either of you are familiar with that happening, or there's only DREs in the polling locations.
So New Jersey is fascinating because, New Jersey was really on the cutting edge of election security about 10 years ago. And they passed 2 laws, one which required paper ballots, and one which required, at that time, really a revolutionary procedure, a risk-limiting audit, really. Unfortunately, the election officials were opposed to that, and that they organized, and their organizing efforts came in tandem with the recession. And the state didn't have enough money to pay to either retrofit or to provide new equipment to all of the localities. So they subsequently went back in, and the legislature amended the original law requiring a paper trail so that it wasn't effective until the state and or federal government provided enough money to pay for all new equipment. Without the paper trail, the state has not enforced the post-election audit law, because if you don't have a paper ballot, you can't conduct the type of audit that New Jersey law currently requires.
We have at least one more about model bills on record preservation, and also if there is one in Virginia, and also has anybody done a forensic analysis on the software or the machines, or even in the central tabulator logs? And I'm going to try to get Ron unmuted too, in case he wants to chime in. Ron Vandis from Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah, that would be great.
In DC, we did do a forensic audit of voting equipment in 2010 when I got new voting equipment. But again, I was fortunate enough that I still had HAVA money to spend on it, and it was an expensive proposition.
I will say this: we in Virginia in 2017, after DEF CON, I went out and to multiple localities and picked up voting machines that were in use and took them to our IT department in Virginia. That's called VETA. I went and personally got the machines because I knew that, well, I believed that the voting equipment vendors would not provide equipment to allow us to do independent security testing. That turned out to be right, because there was one piece of equipment that was in use that I wasn't able to get from a locality. And we subsequently called HART and asked them to provide us with an e-slate for testing, and they refused. However, we were finally able to get that piece of equipment. So we took all of the equipment that was in use, we took it to VETA and asked them to do independent security testing. We were under a very tight timeline because the election was coming. We did not release the reports of the preliminary security testing because our sister states, some of our sister states were and are still using that equipment. I can tell you that the preliminary results of that testing was scary, and obviously, as you know, subsequently Virginia decertified all of the paperless DREs in the state 59 days prior to our November general election.
Okay, I have one. Oh, Ron, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, thanks. Specifically on what, Akane?
You had raised a lot of points in the chat as well. We were talking about forensic analysis of machines and if and where it's been used and has it been effective.
Sure. So Jill Stein campaign actually also had lawsuits in Pennsylvania, both held in the Philadelphia court and in the Pittsburgh court. And I attended the hearings in Pittsburgh. And election officials were making the unbelievable claim that they had performed the forensic analysis before the election.
Can you speak
That's
up,
sort of
Ron?
like CSI. I'm sorry?
Can you speak up?
Yeah, sure. So election officials here had claimed that they had performed the forensic analysis before the election, which is sort of like CSI investigating a crime before it's committed. There's a lot of misinformation also about what constitutes a forensic analysis. So again, the officials here were saying that they tested all the machines thoroughly, and one has to ask exactly what was tested and exactly what do those tests prove. So for example, here we do a firmware verification, that proves that for a very small sample of machines, those machines are running the firmware that was certified by the Secretary of State. But it does not really say anything about the quality of that software. So if the Secretary of State certified poor software, then we're just saying that the sampled machines have the same poor software. And also, the sample was so small, in fact, 20 machines out of more than 4,600 machines, that you could question the statistical validity of that test. So the long and the short is you really just always have to dig deeper and ask exactly what is being tested, exactly what do those tests prove, and how well do they prove it.
Thanks, Ron. So we're running out of time here. I want to respect people's time. If you want to get active, please go to secureourvote.us. Many of you are already active in your states as is. I think one thing that's really helpful, especially if you're trying to do outreach, reach new people, is to describe the different ways that a hack or a computer error can take place and what we might see and what we might not see, and just sharing the reality that particularly where there's no paper or there's no audits, we might not ever be able to find out if there was a hack or error, or if that was the accurate result, particularly if there's no exit polling, or if there's a hack of a voter registration system where they're targeting low propensity voters who may not register complaints if they're turned away. So obviously there's some real concerns, but just educating people around you about what to watch for, even if, it's just a way to prepare them so that we can then pivot and say we need paper, we need audits, we need recovery plans in place. That's just one more advocacy perspective that I'd suggest to you, because many people are totally new to this issue and need to understand more what we're dealing with, so that we don't have, if we do have problems in 2018, we don't have a situation where folks are saying, well, we can't prove anything, so nothing happened. So that's my parting piece. I'm gonna actually unmute everyone so we can all say bye. And thanks so much for participating.
No, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Thanks, Ron. Thank you for popping on.
I guess I can't actually unmute everyone. I apologize. I thought that was an easy thing to do, but it's actually extremely difficult. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Feel free to email questions to info@secureourvote.us. Thanks.